So we're continuing our summer series. We're looking at passages that are on the hearts of the speakers. A lot of those have been from the Psalms, but we had Chris last week speaking from Genesis 24. I got to hear that even though I wasn't actually around on the Sunday because I helped record it. Really loved just digging into that story of Abraham's servant and his journey of trust, which is really, really good. So today we're going to be looking at Proverbs, and in chapter 3, as Stephen said. I'm just going to read the first few verses of, it's first 12 verses of Proverbs 3. Just to say as well that you may have picked up already, we're going to run just a little bit longer today. No apologies for that. I hope it'll be good fun. I've got some stories coming up as well, which will be good listening. So no apologies, but we'll probably run to about 3/4 of an hour rather than half an hour, as you may have noticed. This is Proverbs chapter 3 then. My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. As a father, the son he delights in. The chapter goes on to talk about the value of wisdom. It's brilliant. But just to frame this passage, I want to briefly tell you about a journey I took once. So I used to take the train to school. It was a 20-minute walk either side of the train journey, 5 minutes on the train. And I was really excited when I hit year 11. And I found out that there was a sixth former who was going from near where I was and driving to school. And of course, this was a great novelty, not least because I didn't drive. But 5 of us would pack into his tiny Austin Metro. Those of you who are too young to remember Austin Metros, they're about the size of a Fiat 500. They're made of cardboard. And we'd pile into this thing and we'd go down these windy country lanes to High Wycombe by whatever speed we could actually manage to get up to, which was probably around about 40 tops, I would have thought. But it was one icy morning. We'd been traveling along, and of course the subject came up because it's a bunch of guys, and in fact the guy who was driving was going to be an engineer. He was really into his physics, and they were talking about icy roads and skids and this kind of thing. And their physics teacher had told them that if you get into a skid on a road, you need to steer into the skid. And we were trying to work out what that meant. Did that mean steer the other way, or they don't say steer into the skid now. They say steer gently in the direction you want to go. But anyway, we were talking about this, and it couldn't have been 2 or 3 minutes later, as we came up to a corner, this BMW came around the corner, clearly going far too fast, and had lost control, and his back end had swung right out. He was coming almost sideways along the road towards us. And I actually don't really remember what happened over the next 20, 30 seconds. You might have experienced that sometimes when there's an unexpected event. I don't really remember. What I remember is about 30 seconds later, we'd gone past, without colliding, this tiny Austin Metro was right up on the bank at the side of the road. And the guy who was driving had successfully navigated that crazy maneuver without skidding. And it struck me that there's a big difference between talking about the theory of something and actually being able to use it usefully in daily life. Now, I'm very, very glad, as were my parents, that Dave was able to use that physics knowledge about icy roads well in a real life situation. But I think sometimes when we read this passage about trust in the Lord and, with all your heart, don't lean on your own understanding, in all your ways submit to him and he will make your paths straight. We think, yes, that sounds great. And we nod sagely. And perhaps we might sometimes say it to somebody else when they're in an awkward, difficult situation. But do we actually know how to use it practically in daily life? I hope we do, but today what I want to do, rather than lay out what I think it means for us all, I want to put out a few offerings, if you like. I want some of the pieces of the puzzle. I want to put them out there and leave you guys to talk about it and to come up with, what does this look like for us in our daily life? Just a quick framer, the whole book of Proverbs is built around some key assumptions. And these assumptions are really important to understand, because sometimes you'll read a proverb which will say something like, the righteous prosper and everything goes well for them, but the wicked always come to ruin. And you think, well, I know somebody who's pretty wicked and they're not coming to ruin. And we think, what's going on here? But the book of Proverbs is built around an assumption that God made the world to work a certain way. And what it's describing is the way God made the world to work. The other assumption that comes with that is that the reason that the world works that way is that God's character, God's nature is baked into his creation. Like the world is created as God's world. The universe obeys God's rules. It follows his nature. So Proverbs says we need to understand more of God's character as it's baked into the fabric of the world, and that's called wisdom. If we understand wisdom, we'll live differently and it will have good outcomes. But in the book of Proverbs, the responsibility for applying that wisdom lies very clearly with us. The book's full of instructions. Live this way, do this, don't do that, avoid this, run after that. So one way that we could look at this verse of trusting in the Lord with all your heart and not leaning on your own understanding is to summarize it like this. There's two different ways of thinking. There's how we innately think the world should be, and then there's how God made the world to be. And it's about saying, look, instinctively, I think the world should be like that, and I want to do this because that's how I think the world works. But actually, I know that God's like this, and he's made the world like this, so I'm going to do that instead. So live God's way instead of ours by trusting that the way that the world is actually like God says, not like we say. Now, there is a lot going for this. To put God's character and God's ways above ourselves is to submit to him in a way, and that's what the passage tells us to do. Actually, I've got a friend who he's in business. He's a very successful businessman, actually, and we did actually briefly do business together when I was working in IT as well. He works in the printing industry, and he was known throughout the printing industry for his integrity. Now, this frequently came at deep financial cost to him. There were times when suppliers let him down, and through no fault of his own, he was unable to just simply produce the order as it had been ordered. So he would, at his own cost, rush jobs, draw in other materials, other suppliers, and bear the cost himself so that he could honor his word and deliver what he said he would deliver. And people would often say, look, how do you run a business this way? The world says, look, if there are things beyond your control, you need to pass on some of that cost to your end customers. You can't just absorb it all yourself. And he said, no, God's promises are always true. God's word is always yes and amen. When he says something, it's entirely trustworthy because God's promises never fail. So I want my promises not to fail. I want my word to stand as my bond, because that's how God made the world to work. I have to say, God has prospered him in that, but it's come at great personal cost. So that could be one way of looking at this trust in the Lord. Two ways to think of things: how we innately, instinctively think that the world should be and what we want to do, and then going, but what about how God made the world to be, God's character? Let's do that instead. But I want to ask, does that explanation leave you just a little bit dissatisfied? It does me, I think. It lends itself to a sort of an understanding of the Christian life where God's given us the world and given us his rule book and said, okay, off you go. I'm going to check out for a bit. You get on with living the right way. And that can't be the complete picture, can it? Because God made us to relate to him. We could read passages like John 15, the vine and the branches, and we see that our life is bound up in ongoing connection with God. We have to remain in the vine, receiving life from the vine. And so we have to have a more relational life with God than just saying, here's his instructions, let's go and live them out. Ironically as well, this way of thinking can also leave us quite self-centered. And I'm speaking here from experience. If we take on board God's wisdom and then we sort of set about orienting everything that we have influence over to work that way, we can end up thinking about the world around ourselves as though we're the center of the universe, and we're taking God's wisdom and applying it in everything that relates to us. And I've seen this in my own life. We can end up actually being quite self-centered. We need to have something that expands our view to see more of God's view of things. So, okay, that's one idea and some problems with it. And you want to probably talk out some of those later on as well and see, is that a way that we can use this passage, live this passage out? How could we get around some of those pitfalls? But I want to offer up another one. What if this trusting in the Lord is a more interactive thing? And just to help us with that, I want to draw on some words that Jesus spoke, which I think we all believe, but yet struggle to believe. I'm going to read them from Mark, but they come up in Matthew and Luke as well. This is Mark 11. And Jesus says, "Have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea,' and doesn't doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you've already received it, and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive your sins." Now, this is a different level of trust, isn't it? You know, our understanding says mountains don't move, but Jesus says that if we trust by asking in his name, if we trust in the Lord in that way, that mountains will move. There's this deeper level of trust that's about engaging with God relationally and saying, "God, this is what I think you want. Now I'm going to ask you boldly and trust that you're able to do it." And it's just going that relational level further than simply receiving instructions and acting on them, if you see what I mean. But this has its problems as well, doesn't it? And we have to do business with the fact that there are some mountains that people have asked God to move which haven't moved. And there are some things that you and I have prayed, and we have fervently believed that God is going to answer them, and yet we haven't seen the answer we were asking for. We need to do business with that. Perhaps there's some clues in this Proverbs chapter, just as a hint, there actually are some clues in this Proverbs chapter that might help us to understand what's going on there. But you'll probably want to discuss that drawing on other scriptures that you know of as well. There's two little pieces of the puzzle that I hope will be helpful for your conversations later. I want to finish, actually, though, with a story. And it's a story about a chap called Bob Goff, who's a believer. He's also a very wealthy lawyer, which may feature slightly in some of what comes up in terms of what he's able to do. But this story illustrates something beautiful about what it is to trust in the Lord, because this story is about him and his children. And as I read it, I'm going to paraphrase some in the middle because there isn't time to read the whole thing, sadly. But as I read it, just think about how his children relate to him, what their relationship with him looks like, and how trust looks like in that setting. So this is Bob writing. "When the kids were growing up, we didn't have a television in the house connected to a cable or an antenna. If something bad happened in the world, I wanted the kids to hear about it from me. Whether it was the news that the president had a girlfriend or that a plane hit a building, I thought the kids should hear about it from their parents. So on the morning of September the 11th, 2001, I rushed home before the kids left for school and gathered them around our dining table and told them what had happened. Like everyone else, we struggled for words to describe to our kids why such a thing would occur. We talked about the presence of evil and the presence of good and how good ultimately wins. It was hard to really feel it, though, as if I was mouthing the words. After talking for a while, I asked the kids this: if you had 5 minutes in front of a group of world leaders, what would you ask them to help make sense of life, faith, hope, and the events that are unfolding around them? Sorry, just interrupting for a second. I've just realized there might be some people who are young enough that September the 11th, 2001 doesn't necessarily mean to you what it might to others. That was the time that terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers and the Twin Towers collapsed. It was a huge, obviously, terrorist attack on American soil, and what launched what's still known as the War on Terror, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. Very topical again now. Sorry, if that point of information is helpful to you. So his kids answered this question. Adam, who was 7 at the time, loved having people over to the house. So I wasn't surprised when Adam said he'd ask the world leaders if they wanted to come over to our house. When you're 7, there's nothing like having somebody over to get to know them better. And maybe he thought having the leaders over to their house could facilitate better understanding between each of them, and they'd become better friends. So I told Adam I thought that was a great idea, and he wrote it down. Richard was next. He asked if each of the world leaders, he wants to ask each of the world leaders what they were hoping for. The idea was that if world leaders knew what each other were hoping for, perhaps they could start hoping for some of the same things. Rich reasoned that the problem was that no one knew what other people were quietly hoping for. His idea sounded great, so we wrote it down as well. And Lindsay was the last to go, and she'd listened to her brother's ideas. As the oldest, she was the precocious one, and she'd written it down already. If the leaders couldn't come over to our house for a visit, then what if she and her brothers went to their houses to ask them what they were hoping for? Even better, she'd written, all 3 kids could do a video interview with the leaders so they could share it with all the others. That way, each of the leaders would know what the others were hoping for, and maybe find they were hoping for the same things. I was amazed at what fantastic imaginations these kids had. They didn't even consider that what they were asking for was absurd or naive, or that they needed to be powerful and famous to ask their questions. Perhaps what the leaders would prefer was a few innocent kids asking innocent questions of them. So I had the kids put their ideas together in one letter. Then we downloaded the names of every president, prime minister, or dictator of every country in the world from the CIA website. We felt like we were hacking into NORAD. It was so cool. The information was all there. We just needed to figure out the addresses. The kids decided they didn't just want to write to a couple of the leaders. They wanted to write to all of them. Hey, why not give them a shot at meeting these great kids, I thought. So we got a post office box, mainly because we didn't want Ahmadinejad to have our address. And Maria and I made a deal with the kids. We told them we'd mail off all of the letters. And if we got even a single yes from one of the world leaders to their request for a meeting, we'd take them. Now, the story goes on, and they get a number of very polite no's, as you might expect, including from Tony Blair. But then they get their first yes from Bulgaria, and they keep coming in. In fact, I think they get 27 world leaders agreeing to meet them, and their parents take them out of school for a term. Teachers twitching a little bit, I can see. And they take them out of school for a term, and they fly them around the world, lawyer resources possibly, but nevertheless. And they meet with these leaders. And what they find again and again is an openness. And they do these video interviews. And at the end of the meeting, they present each of them with a key to their house. And they say, whenever you want to come and stay, here's a key, come and stay. Just going to finish off with this. When the kids returned from one of their trips, they read that Tun Mahathir, the Prime Minister of Malaysia and longest serving leader in Asia, had hosted the World Islamic Conference. He drew significant criticism from the international community by saying the words in his keynote address, "Death to America and death to Israel." Our State Department condemned the comments, but the kids had a better idea. They'd just met with the President of Israel, and they wanted to share his hopes with Tun Mahathir in another meeting in person. They sent a letter, and the next week, they cabled back to say that he'd meet them just outside of Kuala Lumpur the following Wednesday. It's pretty short notice to fly around the world, but we figured, what the heck? So we sold the pickup truck and went, because that's how love rolls. It does. Now, that sounds like a crazy story. Bob Goff is the kind of guy who does stuff that the rest of us perhaps talk about. But what I want to pick up on here is the level of naive, absurd, to use his words, trust that the kids have. They submit what they think would be a good idea to their dad and trust that he will sift through it. And actually, his wife's in the background as well, sifting. It's not so much in that story, but very much so. And they trust that he will sift through it, and that he has the resources and the ability to then provide or to say no. They trust their relationship with him. And there's something beautiful in there about trusting in the Lord, isn't there? So I wonder if that also can shape our understanding of what it is to trust in the Lord. I've got some questions for us to discuss. I'm going to hand back to Stephen, and then as Stephen finishes, we'll put those questions up in front of you, but I'll read them to you just now as well. Can you think of a story when you did something God's way instead of the world's? What happened? How can we remain God-centered when most of our daily choices relate to how we live and act? What about things we've asked for in Jesus' name which haven't happened? Is there anything in Proverbs 3 or anywhere else that helps us to understand? And in the light of your discussion today, how can we make Proverbs 3, 5 to 6 our daily reality?